Okay, our second paper is on dynamic scoring, a progress report on why, when, and how by Doug Elmendorf, Glenn Hubbard, and Heidi Williams. And Glenn will be online momentarily, so we'll have all three authors here. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jan. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back at the Brookings Papers for Economic Activity. I wrote a Brookings paper a decade ago about dynamic scoring, and I did not plan to write another paper on this topic. But Heidi Williams started spending time at the Congressional Budget Office and asking me hard questions about the pros and cons of dynamic scoring. And her questions reinforced in my mind the value of smart academic economists digging into the analysis being done at government agencies, because she prompted me to do some rethinking. And then she persuaded Glenn Hubbard to bring his expertise and experience to join our effort. So we hope that our work can shed some new light on this important topic. We're grateful to Jan and John for inviting us to present here. Grateful to John and to Bill and Debbie, our discussants, and other colleagues for valuable comments on earlier drafts, but I should emphasize that the views that we'll offer are strictly our own. Here's the background. The Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation provide official budget estimates used by Congress in considering possible policy changes. The estimating process is often called scoring. In a typical year, CBO publishes 700 public estimates, and it and JCT provide thousands of private estimates to members of Congress and their staffs as they develop legislation. Budget estimates by CBO and JCT take account of many expected behavioral responses by households, businesses, executive branch agencies, state and local governments, except by longstanding convention, estimates do not include responses that would change nominal aggregate output or income, such as changes in labor supply or productivity. Including such responses would be known as dynamic scoring, as distinct from the conventional scoring. An important question is whether this long-standing convention is the best way for CBO and JCT to serve Congress and the public. Our paper does not recommend a specific approach to scoring, but instead analyzes the economic and institutional issues presented by the choice between conventional and dynamic scoring. I should note that budget estimates are not the only information that CBO and JCT provide. In fact, the agencies do some dynamic analyses outside of the usual scoring process. But the official estimates matter often in policy debates, so they deserve attention. Our paper addresses three key questions about dynamic scoring: why might it be done, when might it be done, and how might it be done. And then we illustrate three examples: potential changes in immigration policies and potential changes in federal investment and permitting, to illustrate the issues around dynamic scoring. Now, logically, the first question is why one might do dynamic scoring. What are the advantages and disadvantages relative to conventional scoring? Well, there are two simple arguments in favor of dynamic scoring. First, a change in a benefit program, say, might induce someone to change their benefit take-up and their work effort. These responses are connected, and both matter for budgetary impact, so it seems natural to include them both in budget estimates. A tax analog would be a change in a personal income tax rate that might change both deductions and work effort. But currently, only one of those, the deductions, are taken up in estimates. The work effort is not. A second reason in favor of dynamic scoring is that policymakers care about the effects of policies on labor, capital, productivity, and other economic measures, even apart from the budgetary impact. So including such effects in budget estimates would provide policymakers with valuable information. So those are two reasons in favor. What then are the reasons to stick with conventional scoring? Well, four concerns about dynamic scoring get the most attention. First, is it feasible to produce dynamic estimates given time and resource constraints? Congress wants a lot of estimates, and it wants them quickly. Dynamic scoring requires more calculations and review than conventional scoring, so it takes longer. One approach, then, is to do dynamic estimates for major legislation, not for other bills. This approach has been adopted by the House of Representatives in a rule for most of the past decade. But the rule has been implemented in a way in which dynamic scoring almost never happens. This histogram shows nearly 3,000 published estimates by the Congressional Budget Office over the last 5 years, arrayed by their gross budgetary effect under conventional scoring. The vertical line is the threshold in the House rule for what constitutes major legislation. And you can see there are vanishingly few estimates that have been done that include the dynamic effects. Another approach is to adopt a standardized and simplified process for dynamic scoring that can be applied in certain policy areas. But I should say that even with simplified processes, dynamic estimates would still take more time to produce than conventional estimates, and that's a trade-off for Congress. A second concern about dynamic scoring is whether the excluded effects are especially uncertain and perhaps relatedly more subject to external pressure on the agencies. In our assessment, though, uncertainty of labor and saving responses to policy changes is no greater than the uncertainty of many other responses that are included in conventional estimates. So the concern about uncertainty is legitimate, but it is not a differentiator between conventional effects and these extra dynamic effects. A third concern is whether the excluded effects are usually small. And yes, relative to the size of the economy, they usually are. But first, it is valuable for policymakers to get objective estimates of whether economic effects would be large or small, rather than just hearing from advocates or opponents extreme claims about those effects. And secondly, even if small, the budgetary effect can be large relative to other budgetary effects of a proposal, and thus can significantly affect the overall estimate. So let me offer examples of each of those points in turn. We show here JCT's conventional and dynamic estimates for 4 significant tax cut bills. Under the conventional estimates used by Congress in the policy debate, shown in the left column of numbers, every one of these bills increases the federal deficit. If you include additional responses, as JCT did after the fact in their dynamic analyses, and that's the second column of numbers, you can see that still all of those tax bills would increase the deficit, but not by as much as under the conventional estimate. And the third column shows that those bills would have had dynamic effects that offset between 5 and 26% of the conventional estimate. It's valuable for policymakers to see that information about both the larger and smaller effects. This next slide, we show estimated effects on the budget deficit of a proposal to increase green cards for holders of advanced STEM degrees. Let me explain. In conventional estimates, additional immigrants are modeled as receiving the federal benefits to which they are entitled. That raises government spending. But the extra income they earn is assumed to be offset by less income somewhere else in the economy in order to hold GDP fixed. And therefore, there's no extra tax revenue that's recorded. So extra spending, no extra tax revenue. The effect is, by construction, an increase in budget deficits. That's shown by the conventional line, the upper line here, which shows an increase in the budget deficit over the first 10 years and a little more beyond that. If one then includes the effects on tax revenue of having additional workers earning income, paying income and payroll taxes, those tax effects outweigh the extra spending, so the deficit actually goes down, as shown by the lower line, which we call the population change approach. And I want to emphasize the difference in these lines doesn't depend particularly on whether the change in the number of green card holders is large or small. The axis would scale, but you'd still have this difference between a conventional estimate and a dynamic estimate, even for very small numbers of additional green card holders. I'm going to skip that slide. The final concern about dynamic scoring that we address is that changing methodology and making estimates more complex might reduce the credibility of CBO's and JCT's estimates. Now, credibility is absolutely crucial. Without agreement by Congress on a common set of numbers, policy discussions would be less coherent, budget process less effective. So maintaining credibility is important, and all else equal, credibility is fostered, we think, by consistency over time in methodology and by simplicity of methodology. But all else is not generally equal. Excluding behavioral responses that people expect to occur itself reduces credibility. And so the history of JCT and CBO's analysis is not one of stasis in methodology or a particular focus on simplicity. Instead, over time, the agencies have made ongoing advances in methodology, usually involving greater complexity, to improve the accuracy of estimates and improve the information presented. The second key question about dynamic scoring that we ask is when might Congress might ask for it. As I mentioned earlier, one approach is to do dynamic scoring for major legislation, which has the advantage of focusing on proposals with the greatest economic impact. And the threshold for major could be adjusted to catch more or fewer estimates. Another approach is to do dynamic scoring for selected policy areas. That would have the advantage of consistency among proposals that Congress will be comparing most closely. It would also allow the agencies to focus their capacity building investments on certain topics. If the latter approach was taken, the value of investments in dynamic scoring capacity would be greatest for topics of broad and enduring interest from policymakers, topics with a substantial research base about the economic effects of policies, and topics where there's a straightforwardness of modeling policy alternatives. Think about things in standardized units, dollars, numbers of people, tax rates, where you're more or less turning a dial. Much harder to do dynamic estimates in cases where there are structural changes in programs or the tax code. I want to emphasize here that all the considerations I've talked about and that we discussed in the paper might evolve over time as the research base evolves, as the capacity of CBO and JCT evolve. That's part of why we try to focus here on a framework for analyzing pros and cons rather than giving an answer about which approach is best. The third key question about dynamic scoring that we address is how it might be done. In the paper, we look at CBO's and JCT's past dynamic analyses, but I'm not going to go into the specifics of that here. The paper then goes on to analyze the illustrative examples I mentioned earlier. One is a potential increase in green cards for holders of advanced STEM degrees. I've already given you the highlight of that work. Our other examples are potential changes in federal investment and federal permitting. For those examples, our model is a report by CBO. CBO's 2021 report on federal infrastructure spending can be applied directly to federal funding for research and development. The report uses flexible modeling organized around 5 key factors: how state and local governments respond to additional federal funding, how quickly funding leads to outlays, how quickly outlays increase productivity, how much outlays increase productivity, and how outlays are financed. Economics research offers evidence on all these factors for federal R&D, and Heidi actually presented a paper this morning at the NBER's Tax Policy and the Economy Conference with co-authors that, in fact, applies this framework to look at research and development spending. CBO's report on increasing federal infrastructure spending might also be applied later to federal permitting. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, requires major infrastructure projects that are federally funded or subsidized to receive permits before construction. Accelerating the permitting process might increase spending on infrastructure projects, might affect economic growth. At this point, the literature is not sufficient in our view to do credible dynamic scoring, but as the research literature in this area develops over time, dynamic scoring will become more feasible in this area as well. Again, illustrating there isn't a simple answer probably to what to do right now or at a particular point in time, but that the right answer might evolve. So I'll conclude here. Over time, CBO and JCT have drawn on expanding evidence bases, built new tools, and gained experience in analyzing the effects of potential policy changes on labor, capital, productivity, and other economic measures, and then the feedback on the federal budget. This kind of information about the effects of policies on economic growth is especially important when labor force growth is slowing and government debt is rising. But decisions by Congress about the extent to which such analyses should be included in budget estimates or perhaps presented in other ways involve trade-offs regarding time, resources, accuracy, and comparability. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. The first discussant is Bill Hoagland.
Thank you, Janice. In 1976, I was a young budget analyst at the newly established Congressional Budget Office. Alice called me over to her office one afternoon and said, "Go over to the Senate Agriculture Committee and explain my estimates." I had developed a very simple linear regression model to estimate participation in the food stamp program at that time, now SNAP, and the cost associated with it. I traipsed over to the Senate Russell building to explain to, of all people, Senator Hubert Humphrey, my estimates and how I was very proud, how the standard error of the estimate meant that the number could range anywhere between X and Y. The senator stopped me. He said, "Son, we don't appropriate dollars in a range. We appropriate dollars a specific number." I tell that story because regardless of whether CBO or JCT are doing conventional or dynamic estimates, ultimately what matters in the legislative process is a point estimate. In fairness to Doug and the authors, the paper acknowledges this, and the estimates are also often uncertain. My commentary here, I feel a little bit out of place, is presented not as an academic scholar or researcher compared to the authors or the audience here, but as a longtime former congressional staffer. The authors are to be congratulated on advancing the dynamic budget scoring debate. The current paper extends and builds upon and modifies Doug's seminal 215 budget paper here at Brookings also of why and how to do dynamic scoring. The paper adds the additional element of when to apply dynamic scoring. I would have added also what should it be added to. Overall, this is another major contribution to the literature. Nonetheless, the paper reaffirms in my mind that the debates surrounding dynamic scoring will remain ongoing. And here at the outset, I want to make differentiate something very specific, as the paper does, between dynamic analysis and dynamic scoring. To this day, the agencies, after 3 decades of debate, limit their dynamic scoring due to the 3 criticisms that Doug has raised: uncertainty, model investments, and time required. The paper provides strong and I think defensible responses to these criticisms. The paper focuses primarily on CBO spending estimates, not JCT's estimates. I welcome this focus. I have long argued that applying dynamic scoring only to the federal tax legislation is incomplete, unfair, and inconsistent if it is not also applied to the major spending programs. I have 2 general comments. First, the authors apparently no longer believe that the current rule triggering, as Doug mentioned, the major legislation, no longer believe that's effective or useful. However, what the paper was not clear was what is being proposed as an alternative to the rule completely. If in the 119th Congress the rule were to be dropped or revised, what would replace it, if anything? Or, as paper leads me to believe, inferred, if nothing else, a one-off consult, negotiate request between Congress and the agencies. Even if there's no congressional rule, it will be hard to put the genie back in the bottle. I doubt the tax writing committees will ever give up on asking JCT to do dynamic scoring. Second, and more specific, what the paper does not adequately address is the application of applying dynamic scoring within the current rules, procedures, and limitations placed upon the agencies by the Congress itself. Here, I'm very specific. Number 1, scorekeeping rules. Number 2, the distinction between interaction between discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Number 3, the jurisdictional disputes related to what we call pay-go and the legislative office requirements, and find the available resources. On the question of why, maybe more important today, and to this audience I need not deliberate on it, is the politically charged environment we live in. And with a burgeoning federal debt growing, both presidential candidates raised the issue of dynamic scoring even if they don't realize it. And they do it in a way, unfortunately, that does not satisfy my concerns about the country's unsustainable fiscal future. In response to a question back on August the 18th of how the Harris administration would pay for her proposals, the Vice President responded, "Investing in a broad-based economy, everyone benefits, and it pays for itself in that way." I'm from the bipartisan policy, being very bipartisan about this. In a speech on August the 23rd in Arizona, former President Trump was asked how he would pay for the centerpiece of his economic agenda, which was extending the 2017 tax cuts. His response, growth, we're going to have tremendous growth. I am pleased that the authors, at least in the footnote, Doug, that they maintain the hypothesis that deficits are not self-financing, clearly including the effects of labor supply, savings, and investment and productivity into cost estimates will improve estimates if, requoting from your 2015 paper, quote, "The estimates are for policies that are likely to have significant feedback effects if the estimates of those feedback effects are centered around the actual effects and if the spread of those estimates is small." Meeting these three factors, significant, centered, and small spread, the authors initially asserted in their earlier paper that there was not a high bar to reach. I'm pleased that they dropped that high bar definition. The famous British statistician, George E.P. Box, is remembered for his salient observation that, and I quote, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." So yes, I think dynamic models are useful. CBO and JCT should continue to provide dynamic analysis and, when appropriate, dynamic scoring, but when and to what? Here the answer is a little bit more nuanced. It depends. I agree that in recent years, the agencies have invested a lot in the tools of dynamic analysis and gained much experience from that analysis. Those have, however, been targeted, one-off investigations, such as the specific CBO analysis that the paper identifies. Developing dynamic scoring for different areas of policy also makes perfect sense, but it requires the agencies to forecast, project, and prioritize what major policies the Congress will likely address in the future. That's not going to be easy to do. Further, if we are abandoning the major legislative rule for who should determine when to apply dynamic scoring and for what policies, in order to maintain CBO and JCT's credibility and, quite frankly, their funding base, this ultimately must be a decision between the client, Congress, and the agencies. The Budget Act, in creating CBO, defines as its duties and functions, first and foremost, assistance to budget committees, second, assistance to the Committee on Appropriations, all other committees to the extent practicable. I am biased, I admit. I was on the Budget Committee a long time. But I conclude that the process for making decisions about dynamic scoring belongs first with the chairman and ranking members of the Budget Committee and the Joint Committee on Taxation and the agencies themselves, followed by particularly the committee that butters their bread, the Appropriations Committee. Those committees will, of course, consult with their leadership. I note that the agency's combined resources over the last 8 years has been a 1% real increase, requiring additional analysis, dynamic analysis will put a strain on the agencies going forward unless those resources are to increase. Dynamic analysis will always take a back seat to the regular order of doing the conventional estimates. Doug had a figure, it's more like 900 annual conventional estimates. Phil can justify or can clarify that. 900 annual conventional CBO. Joint tax does 3,500 estimates on bills and admins. That's an average. In 2017, the last time we did a major tax bill, JCT received over 7,000 requests. Further, given Congress' propensity to stack major legislation into the final days of a session, and given the time required to produce dynamic estimates, the inevitable tensions with CBO and JCT and members of Congress need to be resolved to be avoided. Dynamic scoring will take time. On how, and here the paper's R&D discussion highlights one concern I have. Set aside whether R&D productivity effects are different in done in a tax bill or in an appropriation bill. Current scorekeeping rules apply. Those rules allow the tax writing committee to be scored with the macroeconomic benefits of increased revenues from providing R&D tax credits by using the additional dynamically scored revenues to offset other non-dynamically stored tax provisions. However, if increased direct appropriations in the appropriation process for R&D funding were to be provided, it would not provide the appropriators committees with any additional flexibility to increase appropriations in other non-dynamic dynamic spending provisions. The example, I think, requires a rethink of congressional scorekeeping rules if dynamic scoring is to be applied fairly to both spending and revenue legislation. Specifically, something we call Rule Number 3. This rule prevents CBO from attributing appropriation increases in a particular account that might result in reduced spending in a mandatory account being scored to the appropriation account. And this is important when you have discretionary caps, as we have over last year. And this is a slippery slope that follows when we say what to apply dynamic scoring for discretion. Should an increase in discretionary spending in the WIC program funding, which would potentially results in a reduction in the mandatory Medicaid spending, should that be allowed? If so, who should be scored, if you like, with the reduction, the Senate Finance Committee or the Senate Appropriation Committee? While recently restricted somewhat, one-time changes in mandatory spending programs done in appropriation process, what we call CHIMPs, will be scored to appropriators. The immigration population model I like is a very good approach to providing partial analysis of immigration policy. But other than immigration, few other policies came to my mind that would have the same kind of direct population impact. The exception might be in health policy, which leads me to my disappointment that the paper leaves aside dynamic scoring in health care. Given the future growth of federal spending on health care, the population-based model could apply here. As an example, the model could apply where Medicare population with specific metabolic conditions qualify for, as an example, anti-obesity medication. Finally, a full dynamic analysis of immigration, or for that matter, any other major federal policy, would include the impact of the policy on state and local entities. Section 202 of the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995 requires CBO to analyze the impact of federal legislation on state and local. In conclusion, in a very polarized political environment with multiple stakeholders and advocates advancing their own political agenda, broad systems thinking is required. A robust application of dynamic scoring applied to major public policy issues as presented in this paper is an important tool to inform and guide policymakers in managing this rich and complex system we live in today. However, when to apply dynamic scoring to specific legislation, unfortunately, I conclude probably not right now. Individual one-off CBO JCT estimates that incorporate the variance of dynamic analysis should continue and will add to the general knowledge of the decision makers. However, applying dynamic scoring more broadly to reported legislation at this time, I think, remains questionable. This is particularly true given the current official scorekeeping rules. Those rules admittedly focus on deficits in the near term. Dynamic scoring, by its very nature, has a long-term fiscal policy focus. Should those rules be changed or modified? It's unclear. Until they are changed or modified, however, dynamic scoring could delight some program advocates for increased mandatory spending or reduced taxes and disappoint others, those who are funded by discretion. We simply also cannot ignore the fact that some of those who advocate for dynamic scoring also advance a progressive agenda. That today will conflict with conservative limited government agenda. The debate will go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. The second discussant is Debbie Lucas.
Cool. Good. Well, it's great to be following a legend like Bill Hoagland on the budget community. I actually entered the dynamic scoring debate a quarter century after he did when I went to the Congressional Budget Office to work with Dan Crippen in 2000. Dynamic scoring was a very hot and contentious topic then. Dan Crippen was strongly against it, and I got a text from him this morning which said, I'm still against it. But then I went back to CBO, and my latest boss there was Doug Elmendorf. So it's a privilege and also very daunting to be discussing a paper where he's the co-author, especially when I'm not in total agreement. But we'll let the chips fall where they may. So I'm just going to give some framing comments on the purposes, processes, and politics of scoring to frame my comments. I want to delve more deeply into pros and cons of alternative approaches to scoring and talk about the immigration and the productivity example and a few conclusions. So, budget scores are incredibly important. They are the price system facing federal policymakers. I like to call it the visible hand that's going to guide the allocation of scarce public resources between competing uses. And I want to emphasize that in thinking about really what do these scores do, I think its highest value added is in informing policymakers about microeconomic trade-offs. If I'm thinking about an insurance policy and I want to add a greater deductible, how much resources are freed up to do other things in the budget? So I think really it's microeconomic allocational guidance rather than its macroeconomic implications like what's going to happen to the deficit, which are really important because we can figure out what's going to happen to the deficit without delving into these kind of technical details of the budget score. Okay. So I also think, everyone has kind of said this, but I want to just emphasize that it is really important in thinking about the pros and cons of changing the budget scoring process, that budget scores are necessary, but definitely not sufficient statistics for policy analysis. It's really important to understand that the budget is a rule-based measure of what policies costs. Budget scores simply don't attempt to measure benefits. This is probably the crucial observation that's going to go through all my comments, which is, I think one of the beauties and the strength of the budget process is, in fact, it only does aim to measure costs. You can't decide if a policy is good or bad based on cost, but then again, it's very difficult to measure benefits, arguably impossible for most things. I always like to give the example of take buying another missile for the Defense Department. We know exactly what it costs, but we have no idea really how to quantify the benefits. So it's a large asymmetry between those two things. Okay, but aside from the issue that benefits are not included, there are already a lot of biases relative to what economists would like in budget scores, even as a measure of cost. So I've enumerated them here. There is this 10-year budget window for some of the policies that come up in this paper, like immigration. A lot of the effects are beyond 10 years. There's no discounting. There's no accounting for likely reauthorizations. My own career has focused a lot on problems with accrual estimates in the budget. I'll say they're biased, but not go any further than that. And then also this idea of unfunded mandates. There's a lot of policies that have the incidence of a tax. When you tell a company they have to do something, it's like a tax, but it isn't included in the budget. So by no means is the budget even a comprehensive measure of cost. And I mentioned that partly because when we're thinking about expanding to dynamic scoring, the question is, what do we gain on the margin given these other distortions are there? Okay. It also came up, that CBO has very limited resources. I thought it would be useful for the audience to just get a sense of how limited. My summary statement on that is CBO is far, far under-resourced compared to, say, the Federal Reserve. So for all of you central bankers, if you would donate a few of the staff of the Federal Reserve system to the Congressional Budget Office, we might have better policy outcomes all around. But in any case, CBO, I know, it's going to be controversial, but not to the CBO side of the room. Okay. So there's about 220 analysts at CBO, and of those, about 90 are in BAD, the Budget Analysis Division, and those are the people who do the budget scoring. The rest of the organization supports budget scoring, but they're the ones who create other reports that also help to inform Congress. In terms of dynamic scoring that brings in macroeconomics, it's important to understand that within CBO, the Macroeconomic Analysis Division has good people, but there's only 15 analysts. So if you imagine the task of expanding to take into account the macroeconomic effects on all these 700 or 3,000 or however many estimates, there really isn't the capacity to do that in any detail. So if you did go and do that, you would have to do it by necessity in a rather superficial way. Okay, so this has already been mentioned too, but I want to say that really what drives my comments and where I come down on dynamic scoring is that lawmakers have widely divergent views on what the truth is, particularly about the benefits of different policies. And it's of paramount importance that they continue to support this process whereby CBO numbers continue to be the arbiter of what cost is. So that agreement has held. It's certainly been challenged at certain times in the past, and I would argue that that agreement is really fragile, especially at such a contentious political time as we have right now. So I think when we're thinking about how we want to change the budget process, protecting the credibility and perceived neutrality of the estimation process has to be a top concern. And I think in order to do that, we really need to have budget rules that continue what some might think is an overly narrow focus on costs and not on benefits, because as soon as you come to benefits, no matter how many academic studies you have, different people are going to have different notions of what truth is, and it's just going to, I think, make it harder to maintain this agreement to use CBO scores. And also CBO does have these other mechanisms to produce fuller policy guidance, just not in the form of policy scores. Okay, so I wanted to delve a little bit more deeply into the alternative approaches to scoring, the status quo as opposed to dynamic scoring. And I want to actually add a critical distinction that isn't in the paper that I think is important in this discussion of where we might go in changing the rules. So just very quickly, the current approach is imagine that Congress proposes policy A, they send it to CBO, the lawyers there read language, the analysts look at it, and they think, well, okay, this is, and I want to talk about an appropriated policy. So maybe Congress is going to make $1 million available to it, but we actually think that the take-up is going to absorb less than $1 million because there aren't enough eligible participants to really use that full million. So you're going to do this behavioral adjustment, which I actually think of as primarily a demand adjustment, and then CBO is going to come back with a budgetary score for policy A. So that I would call a narrow behavioral and typical status quo approach to scoring. So what's nice about this is it's simple, it's easy to explain, transparent. You don't need a lot of information, although it does require gathering information. But as the paper very clearly says, for large proposed expenditures or laws that cause major changes to the rest of the budget, it can result in significant bias. So enter dynamic scoring. We still have the same policy A that comes into CBO, and we're still going to think about narrow demand effects. But now we're going to think, well, also, what does this policy do to the macroeconomy? Doug emphasized GDP, but I think various aspects of the macroeconomy. But then, furthermore, not only are we going to see what it does to the macroeconomy, but we're going to see how those macro effects feed back to the rest of the budget, standing policies. So say we have a policy that expands GDP, it increases tax revenue and all of that, so that's coming back through all these other policies. What I want to emphasize on this slide is actually dynamic scoring here consists of two distinct things. One is analyzing macroeconomic effects, but the other is then identifying spillover effects, which is how those macro effects are going to affect the cost of all the other policies that the government is undertaking. So certainly this can add accuracy in some cases, but it has a lot of shortcomings. And the paper defends that CBO has good enough models in order to do the macro part well. And I could quibble with that, but I have very little time, so I'm not going to here. I will in my written comments. But what I think is most important is this opening the door to really focusing on spillover effects, because I would argue that spillover effects lead you down a slippery slope to asking questions about how the benefits of a particular policy are going to affect particular other policies. So in fact, I want to say that another approach, and one I think actually the paper kind of opens the door to, but it isn't given a different name, I wouldn't call it dynamic scoring, because to me the dynamic word means you're inserting the macroeconomic piece. But rather it's the question of, well, when you look at policy A, should you also assess how it affects policy H and policy T? And in fact, maybe those direct effects are much more important than the indirect macroeconomic effects, because there's a lot of policies that have a very small effect on the macroeconomy, but they might have a huge effect on other policies. So for example, if the policy were to fund a vaccine that cures cancer, it would greatly reduce healthcare costs. So the direct effect would be very large, but arguably the macro effects would be much smaller. Okay, so just to quickly talk about immigration, one reason I brought approach 3 to the table was to say that, interestingly, the way CBO currently treats immigration really seems to match, from their description, my approach number 3. And I would say that that kind of tension between CBO and JCT is kind of taking approach 1 and CBO is taking approach 3, and that's where you're getting this disconnect in which is creating a bias towards underestimating the positive effects of immigration. But as the authors note, we don't need a full-blown dynamic score to remedy this. And as they also suggest, labor supply effects would be an elegant way of kind of reconciling the differences between what JCT does and what CBO does. So I almost was on board with that. But then I thought about it more, and I thought, well, but another way to reconcile the two approaches would actually have CBO take a more conservative approach and go back to approach 1, because what CBO is doing is they're trying to say, well, immigration would do this to welfare programs and would do this to other spending programs, but it's not that comprehensive. So perhaps CBO, wow, that was bad, could take a more modest approach rather than having JCT take a more expansive approach. But I could be very comfortable with the labor supply effect. On productivity, I actually think this is a very good example of why it can be very problematic to start to introduce more spillover effects. I mentioned this discussion to one of my more conservative friends, and she was on the fence about whether it was a good or bad idea to have dynamic scoring. And I said, well, they want to score positive effects of productivity enhancing programs. She said, oh, no, I wouldn't want to go to dynamic scoring for that. But I mean, it just kind of speaks to how contentious some of these things are. And I think productivity is kind of key on that. So just, I'm not going to read all my conclusions, but I want to say that the issues raised in this paper are extremely important, and they actually underscore the need to seriously revisit the budget process in many dimensions. I mean, the 1974 Budget Act set out a lot of these rules, and I don't think there's been a gathering that has seriously revisited those rules in light of all the things that have progressed since that time. And so I think this paper is a great reminder that these are issues that are very important, that we need to think more about them. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. So the first response goes to Phil Swagel.
Great. Thanks, Jen, very much. And there's other CBO colleagues here, so if someone after me says something egregious, maybe someone else can respond, or I can come back. So let me just start by saying thank you. Oh, good, Glenn. Thank you. Thanks to the authors. It's a very distinguished group, and we really appreciate this input, and that's the biggest takeaway. So obviously everything else I have to say is notes of caution, but don't let the balance of words distract you from my feeling. And I really encourage anyone who has suggestions on what dynamic analysis we should be doing to please tell us. Tell me, tell Jeff. Julie Topoleski is here, oversees our labor work. So there's lots of ways to tell us. And members want this. Members of Congress want dynamic analysis from CBO. JCT could speak for themselves. I assume they get requests for it also. And we're working to do more. Immigration is part of that, and I think we've done a tremendous amount of work, and we're still doing a lot more work on immigration. Obviously, again, tax policy at JCT, we're thinking about where else would it matter, and the discussants mentioned some things. We're thinking about health, Bill. We're thinking about, I'm working on hepatitis C, so you treat a lot of people for hepatitis C. Maybe people will work instead of be on the sidelines. Labor policy, energy policy, regulation. We're not really set up to do regulation, but members want it, so we're trying to think. So anything that affects growth, we're trying to think about it. As the paper says, we did work on infrastructure investment, and we focused on roads and bridges, which was a part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was enacted. I thought it was a really nice paper, and actually thank you to the authors for highlighting it. It was 30 years, right? It takes 7 years to build a road or a bridge, and then you get lots of benefits. There's productivity spillovers, and that affects GDP, comes back to revenues. So we did, looking at over 30 years, used essentially accrual accounting, different discount rates, different crowding out assumptions. I thought it was a really nice paper. Congress operates in nominal dollars, and members of Congress think in nominal dollars, and they think over 10 years. So, that's just the reality. And so it was a really nice paper, but probably the impact on the legislative process was modest just because of that reality. Now, the same legislation that included the money for roads and bridges also had money for electric buses. I live in Montgomery County. I think Montgomery County now has electric buses from that money. It also included money for rural broadband. Now, we need an evidence base. What's the dynamic effect of those? But then, because that's one, and the authors say that, once there's an evidence base, it's really hard to think about implementation. And so think about rural broadband. And my understanding is that the way the executive branch is deploying those dollars is somehow they're not using the service that provides high-speed broadband to rural areas and is widely used and accepted by the private sector. They're doing something else or some mix of other things. I don't think we could have predicted that. Maybe we should have, but boy, that would really confound our dynamic analysis. And it would be really difficult. And think about the CHIPS Act provides resources and leads implementation to the executive branch. It'd be really hard. A green investment bank in the future. Okay, so again, these are the words of caution. One other word of caution it's not a caution, but it's just something to think about is, in some sense, to what extent will this matter for policy? And as the authors say, policymakers get a lot of information, from us, but they get a lot of information on their own, and they, as they should. And so things like immigration, my experience is that policymakers understand the economic impacts of immigration. I don't know if they have Cobb Douglas in their minds or something, but whatever, but they get it. It makes me think of the late Dale Jorgensen, actually, but they get it. And they don't agree on every particular. They think we're missing information on state and local governments and the impact on state and local governments, but they get it. And so just the paper highlights the kind of high-powered nature of high-skilled immigration, and it just the caution is I don't think that's our dynamic analysis is not the thing that's stopping anyone's preferred immigration policy from going forward. It's a tough policy area, and there's just lots of barriers to that legislation. So again, the authors know this. So that's my other caution. And yeah, let me just go back and I just need to set realistic expectations. Debbie's explained some of them on what CBO can do, and then my caution is the extent to which it will matter. So that's enough of the cautions. And again, thank you. It's a great paper. We're working on it. I'd be grateful for any suggestions on what more we should do.
Okay, so we'll go over to Alan Auerbach and then Wendy Edelberg.
Excuse my hoarseness. 2 points. First of all, in answer to one of Debbie's suggestions about considering spillover effects explicitly, I think that's already part of the scoring process. When you increase the standard deduction, that's going to affect the other deductions that people take, and that's already a full part of the scoring process, and that would be true of having one government program expand. It would then cause people not to need to get benefits from another program. That's already part of the standard scoring process. So I think it's a good thing to do, but I think it's already being done. The point I was going to make is that going to dynamic scoring is going to absolutely require the agency doing the scoring to make assumptions about future government policies and future monetary policy. So, for example, you have a policy that increases the deficit. What is the deficit feedback rule? Well, we'll talk about that tomorrow morning. But you have to assume something. Okay, the deficit goes up because of this tax cut. What is the future path of fiscal policy in response to that? Now, if you say it's nothing, then what you're really saying is, well, it's nothing in the next 10 years, but in the years after that, it's going to have to be something because eventually things are going to unravel. Likewise with monetary policy. This is a inflation increasing policy. The Fed has, as we've just discussed, the Fed has a policy of dealing with inflation. That has to be built in. So you have to make explicit assumptions about fiscal responses and monetary responses. You also have to make assumptions about what other governments do. So just for example, suppose, just to randomly pick a policy, suppose we were thinking of imposing a 20% tariff on all imports. I know it sounds crazy, but just imagine. Then, okay, do other governments retaliate? On which sectors do they retaliate? This is obviously going to have macroeconomic consequences, whether you assume no retaliation, and those have to be incorporated. And there's two concerns one might have about this. One is, how good are your forecasts about this sort of thing? And that's just part of the general problem of dynamic scoring. But the other is the controversy that, particularly in the case of fiscal policy, you're telling Congress, here is what we think you're going to do in the future in response to what you're doing now. And that is very much at odds with the way scoring typically goes, which is to not assume facts not in evidence, that is not to incorporate in baselines policies that have not yet been adopted.
Wendy?
So I'm happy to be going right after Alan because, in fact, my first point was about the baseline, where all of the issues that you just described have to be grappled with. so CBO's economic and budget baseline have to incorporate some path for monetary policy. And it is, very disciplined to be a current law baseline. Then you might say, but surely, where's your closure rule? And what I'll say is, the way I described it when I was there, our closure rule is basically like our collective closure rule that we all have in our heads of what's going to happen to fiscal policy, 50 years from now, 100 years from now. Like, we're all here living our lives. We're not, hiding in bunkers eating Spam. Like, somehow we think, even given, given current law, we think that somehow the U.S. government will continue to be a going concern. So I think all of those things are somehow in CBO's baseline, which brings me to Debbie's point about benefits. So CBO's baseline has to incorporate all of the feedback of current law to the macroeconomy. Maybe not at the provision by provision level, but certainly for big provisions, CBO is thinking hard about how fiscal policy affects the macroeconomy. And I just want to make sure that you guys aren't thinking about benefits in a broader sense than I think Debbie probably means it. When you think about dynamic scoring, the benefits that would incorporate is only the feedback to the budget. It's not what you might be thinking of the broad benefits of fiscal policy. So take, for example, if policymakers were contemplating a massive cut to current Social Security benefits. If you were to ask what's the dynamic score of that, it would be a big increase in labor force participation, particularly among Social Security recipients, higher saving rates, et cetera. All of those things would have positive feedback to the budget, but very arguably, we would have different, arguments about what the effects were on welfare. The last thing I want to say is, as much as policymakers really want dynamic analysis, it was my experience talking to policymakers and their staff that they really didn't want the score, that they rather have their talking point. Either they thought that the effects were going to be really bad for the economy and they wanted that talking point, and they didn't want to know what our number was, or they thought it was going to be really positive and they didn't want our number. So I think, you really do need a process that doesn't rely on policymakers.
Okay. I'm going to go to Jason and Ben.
So Wendy's last point is why doing this is so important, because people fill in very different numbers than the reality. I would suggest that you put forward a particular policy and dynamically score it. It's to spend $5 million a year to hire 30 more people to do dynamic scoring. And how much better would legislation need to get in order for that policy to pay for itself? I think under any plausible assumption, that would be one of the few free lunch pay for itself that even you, Doug, would agree accomplish that. And then the last thing is, a lot of the comments I'm hearing here sound to me like something is between 0 and 10. You're not really sure if it's 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, so great, let's just put down 0. And that just can't be the right way for an agency to do something.
Okay. Ben and then Bill Gale.
Very quickly, kind of picking up on Jason's uncertainty point, this is more of a question for the authors. How do you think about scoring in the face of extreme uncertainty? So for example, we had a $1.9 trillion ARP bill that was passed before we had an Omicron or Delta wave. We had no idea about the outcome of the pandemic, and therefore we had no idea about the utility of the bill. A more extreme example would be, what if CBO knew with 1% chance an asteroid would hit the United States and there was a $100 billion bill to avoid it? How do you score that? How do you score against these extreme outcomes? And is the current scoring convention fundamentally biased against these type of outcomes? Is it biased against insurance-like programs? Thanks.
Okay. Bill Gale.
Thanks. The paper asks 3 questions: why, when, and how. And it just occurred to me that if you want to know the true costs and benefits, you might add another question, which is over what time period, because some policies, the dynamic effects happen fast. Some policies, like investment in kids, take a long time to show benefits.
Okay. Jonathan Pingle.
Yeah, so the extremely distinguished authors are going to tell me this is self-evident in the paper, which I have actually read. But my question basically is the relative mass of discussion on uncertainty relative to magnitude, right? So, I mean, if I think about CBO, they've revised the spend out for the IIJA pretty much every budget update. The estimates for the IRA are, have been revised substantially, large range of estimates. So there's substantial uncertainty in all of this, and that includes estimates of labor supply. But why wouldn't we consider more heavily, where it might matter, right? Like something like immigration, or where some of the dynamic scoring could really potentially move the needle.
Okay. Mark Goldwine.
Thanks. I apologize. I got to make my statement and then run. But it was a great paper. I want to raise one really practical concern, which has already come up a bit in dynamic analysis, which is so much of the end game of legislation is a very fast amendment process, including a manager's amendment. CBO can barely keep up with static updates to that are really kind of fully static. And I worry that puts you with that creates a very tough choice between really delaying the estimate, Congress has nothing, or forcing policymakers to compare a conventional estimate to a dynamic estimate, which creates all sorts of extra problems.
Okay. Mark Mazer and Brian Sack.
Thank you. I'm going to focus on tax issues and try not to be too cynical. Generally, the revenue estimates, as pointed out, have a big confidence interval around them. And their confidence interval is larger for innovative policies or structural changes. And I think one of the things that happens in the case of dynamic analysis, we forget about this, and we forget about the Joel Slemmerod hierarchy of responses, which are first you get timing changes, then you get paper transactions, then you get tax avoidance, and then way down the list, you get real economic behavior. And what dynamic scoring tends to do is put real economic behavior really up there and kind of give it a lot more emphasis. And I think what that does is give us bias toward tax cuts. And we sort of see that with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and some other recent things, which when we update the estimates, they tend to be smaller macro estimates than they were initially. And so that means that it puts us in a difficult situation going forward for budget deficits and so on. I guess the question is, what are you doing to deal with that systematic bias?
Okay. Brian?
So the question I was going to raise is when and by how much is it appropriate to incorporate a potential response from financial markets? We already talked about we have to incorporate a response from the Fed, which is a very important part of financial markets in terms of the path of the short rates. I think to date, CBO has not generally incorporated a meaningful response of other risk premia in markets, most notably the premia on Treasury securities, whose supply is being directly affected, especially for the larger legislative proposals. And I don't know the answer here. I mean, I think it's hard to say with confidence how market risk premia or the term premia will respond to supply considerations, but it's fundamental to the budget. And obviously interest expense is very large today. And, over the past 2 decades, we have seen a major repricing of treasuries related to supply. Treasuries used to trade at yields below, the 10-year treasury below swaps. Now they're 50 basis points above swaps. That's a huge move. It's just happened slowly, and it's, it's hard to look at any particular week or month or even year and tease out the effect, but it's clearly there. So I think it's an open question, an important one, when CBO should start to incorporate those feedback mechanisms.
Thank you. Henry Aaron.
Two completely different comments. One is to add an item to the spillover effect example that you gave earlier that I think is very difficult. Social Security is in a hole presently, or soon to be, and one of the suggested steps would be to extend the payroll tax to fringe benefits. Now, if one did so, one could imagine a straightforward estimate of the impact of that on revenues, but it would be very hard, I think, to take account of the behavioral responses certain to occur but impossible to specify in the behavior of employers, in the use of Medicare and Medicaid, and on and on. You might want to add that as an example. The other question is speculative. Immigration is a non-budget decision of the government. So is patent law. And yet the impact of patent law changes on revenues and expenditures all over the map probably dwarf most of the legislation that is commonly estimated. Is there any conceivable way of addressing that? And if so, how? It's a stalking horse for a larger class, of which immigration is also an example. Non-budgetary legislation that has a powerful impact on both revenues and expenditures.
Koichiro Ito?
So I'm totally outside of this field, so maybe this point is naive, but I'm wondering why. Sounds like what you need is evidence of behavioral responses for many different things. Essentially, a lot of different elasticity estimates. And I'm wondering if CBO is already trying to take some evidence from different applied microeconomics field. So like labor economics, environmental economics, we try to estimate many different responses. And one concrete example I know is some climate change, some researchers looking at climate change impact. They actually try to collect those like applied micro evidence to put that into kind of bigger model to think about bigger kind of macroeconomic impact. So like similar exercise might be helpful at CBO, and maybe you're already doing it, but I'm wondering if that kind of things could be useful.
Okay. Jeff Kling.
I just want to leave you with a concluding thought which amplifies the first thing that Phil said, which is CBO is committed to continuous improvement, and our goal is to provide the most comprehensive information that we can, to provide information that is higher quality next year than it was this year, and so on. And so the way in which the information is used by the Congress is up to the Congress, and how the Congress chooses to use the information in terms of budget enforcement, they will make decisions about. And it's our job to provide the best information that we can. Related to one of the things that Brian said earlier, in a high-intensity effort, we will try to do an entire counterfactual economic forecast under the policy relative to the baseline, which does aspire to incorporate all of the effects that would go into any baseline forecast, including things that happen with the Federal Reserve, things that happen in financial markets, anything that would affect any of the macroeconomic aggregates. And so, we can't do a new economic forecast for every policy, but just to give you an example of, for the really big stuff, that is our aspiration.
Susan Athey and George Akerlof.
So just a quick comment on the process. I think I might have thought before going into government myself that it would just be impossible to do all of these complex analyses with a small team. But then I supervised a team of a few dozen economists who evaluated a couple thousand mergers a year relatively effectively. Of course, a lot of the way that you do that is you use heuristics, and a lot of the analysis is short term, which also makes mistakes. But I also saw what are some tools that you can use to improve the productivity while expanding the quality of that work to incorporate more complex things. And I think having a lot of case studies, and especially choosing areas of policy focus to develop the expertise, and you just build the muscle. And in my experience in the business world, you can have a very big decision, and yes, they have the resources, but actually it's like 2 or 3 people doing a cost-benefit analysis very quickly, whether it's like a $5 billion decision or like a $5 million decision, because that's just the way decisions get made. So, and how do they do that and not completely run the economy in the ground? Well, it's again, you develop heuristics, you develop experience, you develop measures that sort of stand in for the long-term important things you care about. So the reason I thought it was worth speaking about that here is I do think that there's a way that outsiders can also contribute to this process by continuing to develop the case studies, as you did in your paper, and really work them all the way through. And over time, in specifically the most important policy areas where you think you're getting it the most wrong, you can work out some of the hard issues. And that's what makes it possible for staff to then relatively quickly apply those heuristics where they're not reinventing the wheel every time. So maybe that's something that, you know, we can all contribute to. Thanks.
George?
I just want to repeat that. I am worried that the system as a whole is apt to be gamed, and I feel all kinds of ways to game it. And I guess I've lived around Washington long enough to know that that's possible.
Okay. I think we made it to everybody and nobody online. Good? Okay, then, do you want to, Glenn is going to do the, I'll turn it back to the authors and you can arm wrestle.
Okay, can I jump in?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
please, Glenn.
Sorry for not being there. A boring economist is somebody who gives up a conference dinner in Paris to talk about dynamic scoring. So thanks for having me. I first came across dynamic scoring in 1991. First day I showed up at the Office of Tax Analysis in the Treasury, I received a letter from Congressman Army, who was one of the Republican leaders, criticizing the office for not doing dynamic scoring and calling me a socialist. So I called in the staff leaders and said, I have two questions. What the heck is dynamic scoring? And two, why am I a socialist? So I got involved over many decades in this, actually commented on Doug's Brookings paper 2 decades after that. And some things I think I always believed in, and some things have changed. The things that I always believed were educating members of Congress is important. As Doug said, people want to know this information. It's experts' job to help them. And second, there's uncertainty everywhere, so that can't be an excuse. I think what's changed, and I thought Susan Athey picked this up super well, is the value of processes that bring in outside expert advice. And both CBO and JCT already solicit this advice very well to develop rules of thumb and heuristics, and I think we can be doing much more of this. The discussants have raised a terrific set of points, and I think, yes, I would agree that CBO probably deserves more money, as does the Joint Committee on Taxation, but I think that the staffs really have shown the ability to develop great muscle for doing modeling work over time, and I think this exercise is worth doing. We're not recommending everything as a score. I'm not sure we, among the three of us, even have a uniform view there, but we think it's very important for analysis to do that. I think in terms of the comments and questions, many, many very valuable things raised. To Alan Auerbach's point, I agree that you're implicitly making assumptions about the path of government policy, but you do that in every estimate. If you're assuming that effects somehow get offset somewhere else, if you're assuming that the Fed's maintaining aggregate demand, all of those are assumptions. I'm not sure I see this as much different. In terms of examples about needing to focus on time periods, yes, of course, 10 years is an artificial construct, but a well-done dynamic score or dynamic analysis, I think, can make that clear. As to the case studies, I think our point of view, and Doug only hinted at this in his great presentation, is that we need a process for figuring out which areas matter. Some of that's going to come from members of Congress and the CBO itself or JCT, but some from outside academic experts who say, we know a heck of a lot more about an area like immigration, perhaps today, than we knew in the past. Another example that came up that's related to some of the questions is permitting, which we talk about in the paper. That's not something you normally think of as having budget effects, but as we argue, it can change both the sign and the magnitude of some of the infrastructure effects that we estimate. So again, thanks for the great and very helpful comments.
So thank you. Let me build on Glenn's terrific remarks, all of which I agree with. I'm grateful for everybody's comments, particularly Bill and Debbie. I've learned a great deal from both of them in my time working with them, and it's good to have their perspectives on these issues. I want to do a call out to the amazing analysts at CBO and JCT who do just an incredible job under great time pressure and sometimes other kinds of pressure. And part of why I was persuaded to come back to this topic was the view that they have built more and learned more over the decades since I was at CBO and working with our colleagues at JCT. And it is their progress at doing dynamic analysis that actually gives me reason to want to come back to this topic and to feel positive about what can be done in the future. I came to dynamic scoring 30 years minus 2 months ago. The Republicans won the majority in the House of Representatives in the fall of 1994 for the first time in decades. And that took an issue which had been on the back burner and brought it to the front burner. And as a junior analyst at CBO, I had a chance to participate in some discussions then. One thing I learned was that reputable budget analysts were against dynamic scoring. So I ought to sign up. But the second thing I learned was that the arguments I heard at the time against dynamic scoring seemed to me to apply in many ways also to conventional scoring and to the baselines that CBO constructed. And Wendy and Jason both said things that I want to echo, put emphasis on here. Uncertainty, gaming, these are the difficulty of predicting what policy actors will do. These are the bread and butter of the estimation process. And it is difficult to do, but I think we really, when we form views about dynamic analyses or dynamic scoring as distinct from conventional, we really need to separate the things that are particular to the dynamic part from the problems, the issues that arise across the board. Mark, I just want to say quickly, I can't respond to everybody, but just say, I understand Joel's hierarchy of responses, but the problem today is that the bottom level in that hierarchy, the changes in work and saving, just aren't counted at all in the conventional estimates. So bringing them, the idea of dynamic scoring would be to bring them onto the list, not to put them at the top particularly. But also I want to just close by thanking Susan Athey for her comments, because I do think an absolutely central question here is the extent to which certain things can be standardized, simplified in ways that can be applied more frequently on a shorter time frame. And I'll give just one example. If you change something about the economy, that will change the outcome for the federal budget. And you could turn that question loose to 200 analysts at CBO and have all of them do their pieces and add those things up very carefully. But if you don't have time or patience for that, you can also go to CBO's rules of thumb posted on the website, which will tell you roughly how changes in GDP or inflation or interest rates would flow through to the federal budget. CBO's now posted a spreadsheet, so you can actually put your own numbers in, I guess, and work that out. And so in some cases, at least, there are ways to build simplified approaches that pass some test of credibility, even if they're not as ideal as a full-blown, month-long, agency-wide process. And I think the question, which I don't know the answer to, is how much of that sort of standardization and simplification can be done in other areas to make dynamic analyses, wherever they officially are reported or appear, more feasible for more issues. So I'll stop there. Thank you all very, very much.
Okay, thanks for a great session, the authors and discussants. Glenn, great to see you on full magnitude. So we'll come back at 4:10.